The force that changed the map of Europe did not come from Rome. It did not come from Paris. It did not come from Constantinople. It came from the north. From cold seas, rocky shores, and long winters. Small communities, wooden houses, scattered warrior groups. They were not an empire. And yet, for nearly 3 centuries, Europe could not stop them. They brought kings to their knees. They transformed cities. They laid the foundations of new states. But how? How did a society living on the edge of Europe become one of the most decisive forces of the Middle Ages? This is not just a story of raids. It is the story of a system set in motion. Early 8th century Scandinavia. Land was limited. Farmland was scarce. Winters were long. The population was growing. But resources were not. In many regions, the inheritance system was simple. Land went to the eldest son. The others had few options. You could stay and live a limited life, or you could take a risk. To understand the Vikings, we must see this clearly. This was not a sudden explosion. It was the result of slow, building pressure. Geography shaped them. Limits pushed them outward. Viking power did not come from warfare alone. The real turning point was ahead of its time. Ship technology. The longships were light and fast. They could move through shallow waters. They could cross open seas and travel deep inland through rivers. This changed the direction of war, and Europe did not even realize it. Most European defenses faced the land. The Vikings came from the sea. They could strike quickly and leave just as quickly. This was not just tactical advantage. Ships gave them mobility. Mobility gave them power. The year was 793. The monastery of Lindisfarne, on the English coast, was attacked. The event shocked Christian Europe. But the truth is, Europe was divided. There were small kingdoms. No centralized defense. Monasteries were wealthy and unprotected. The Vikings had found a weak point. Raids continued. Seasonal attacks became regular. And after a while, Europe's question changed. Instead of asking, "How do we stop them?" they began asking, "How do we make peace with them?" This did not mean the Vikings had lost. On the contrary, it signaled a more permanent phase. By the 9th century, something changed. The Vikings were no longer just coming and leaving. They were staying. It may seem like a small detail, but for Europe, it was a turning point. You can repel an attack, but removing a settled power is far more difficult. Large parts of northern and eastern England fell under Viking control. This region became known as the Danelaw. The issue was no longer plunder. It was governance. Collecting taxes, dividing land, establishing legal systems. The same process unfolded in Ireland. Dublin stopped being a raiding base and became a trade center. Then came France. In 911, a Frankish king granted land to a Viking leader. This was not surrender. It was an agreement. Defend us and stay. That land became Normandy. And here the critical question emerges. Were the Vikings destroying Europe? Or were they becoming part of it? Over time, the answer became clear. They converted to Christianity. They married into local aristocracy. They entered the feudal system. They were no longer outsiders. They were inside the system. And once inside the system, removing them was no longer possible. Did the Vikings only target Europe? No. The horizon was not a limit for them. They moved north. They reached Iceland. They settled Greenland. And for a brief time, they reached the coasts of North America. But the deeper transformation happened in the east. This time, the longships entered rivers instead of oceans. They drifted down from the Baltic. They moved along the Volga and the Dnieper. In what is now Russia, they established trade centers. They transported furs, slaves, and silver. These routes led them to Byzantium. They reached Constantinople. Some served as members of the Varangian Guard. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They became part of a trade network, connecting north and south. This was not only military expansion, it was economic expansion. A new connection was forming between Europe and Asia. The land granted in France in 911 would change England's fate a century later. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy conquered England. William's ancestors were Vikings. Just a few generations earlier, they had been raiding coastlines. Now they were sitting on one of Europe's most powerful thrones. This was the final stage of a long transformation. They did not destroy Europe. They integrated with it. The Vikings did not begin as an empire. What set them in motion was not greed, but pressure. What gave them superiority was not brutality, but mobility. What made them lasting was not destruction, but adaptation. Today, their traces remain in language, in politics, in bloodlines. The Vikings did not simply frighten Europe, they reshaped it. And sometimes, history is not shaped at the center, but at the edge of the map. Share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video as we explore another stop in history.